The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Tanaka's karate academy, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. It was 1985, and the small dojo in San Francisco's Japantown had seen better days. Master Hiroshi Tanaka, 62 years old with calloused hands and graying temples, swept the floor with the same methodical precision he applied to every kata. The rhythmic sound of bristles against wood was the only noise breaking the silence that had become his constant companion. 23 years had passed since Hiroshi first opened the academy's doors, filled with dreams of sharing the ancient art of Shotokan karate with American students. Back then, the waiting list stretched for months, and the sound of kiai echoed through the building from dawn until dusk. Parents lined the benches, watching their children learn discipline and respect alongside devastating kicks and precise punches. Hiroshi had been a different man then, younger, optimistic, surrounded by the warmth of his wife Akiko and their teenage son Kenji. The cancer took Akiko first, in 1979. Kenji followed 3 years later, not to disease, but to a drunk driver on Highway 101. The lawsuits from grieving families after a training accident in 1983 had finished what grief had started, driving away the last of his students and leaving Hiroshi alone with his memories and an empty dojo that echoed with ghost voices. He folded the broom against the wall and walked to the shrine in the corner, where incense burned before faded photographs of his departed family. His black belt, earned in Okinawa 40 years ago, hung beside certificates that now felt like relics from another lifetime. The mortgage payment was due next week, and his savings account showed a balance that wouldn't cover it. At 62, starting over seemed impossible, but giving up felt like betraying everything Akiko and Kenji had believed in. The bell above the entrance chimed, startling Hiroshi from his thoughts. A young woman entered, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes bearing the dust and exhaustion of a long day. She clutched the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his oversized jacket hanging loose on his small frame and his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Hiroshi couldn't quite place. "Are you still taking students? My son Marcus needs somewhere to go after school, and I heard this place teaches discipline." Hiroshi studied the boy, noting the way he stood slightly behind his mother, protective but alert. The child's sneakers were worn but clean, his jeans carefully mended at the knee. There was something in the boy's posture that reminded Hiroshi of himself at that age. Small, but determined, watching the world with careful eyes. "I am Master Tanaka," he said formally, bowing slightly. "What is your name, young man?" The boy stepped forward, mimicking Hiroshi's bow with surprising grace. "Marcus Rodriguez," he said clearly. "My mom says you can teach me to be strong." Maria Rodriguez worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices downtown in the early morning hours and stocking shelves at the neighborhood grocery store until late evening. Marcus spent most afternoons at the local community center, but the program was overcrowded and understaffed. She'd noticed him getting into small troubles, nothing serious yet, but the kind of restlessness that could grow into bigger problems without proper guidance. "The monthly fee is $100, Hiroshi said, knowing immediately from Maria's expression that it might as well have been 1,000. He watched her shoulders sag slightly, saw her glance around the empty dojo with its polished floors and pristine equipment, everything maintained to perfection despite having no students to use it. "I understand," she said quietly, taking Marcus's hand. "Thank you for your time." They turned to leave, and Hiroshi felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a stirring of purpose that had nothing to do with money or success. The boy looked back over his shoulder, his eyes lingering on the heavy bags and the mirrored walls, on the Japanese calligraphy that promised strength, respect, and honor. "Wait," Hiroshi called out. "The boy can work for his lessons. The dojo needs help with cleaning, organizing equipment. If he is willing to work, he can learn." Marcus broke free from his mother's grip and ran back to Hiroshi, his face bright with excitement. "Really? I can learn karate. I promise I'll work really hard." For the first time in months, Hiroshi smiled. "We begin tomorrow after school. Wear comfortable clothes and bring respect for the art. Everything else, I will teach you." As mother and son left, discussing the arrangement in rapid Spanish mixed with English, Hiroshi remained in the empty dojo. The silence felt different now, Not the hollow echo of abandonment, but the quiet before a storm of activity. Tomorrow, the wooden floors would ring with the sound of bare feet again, and perhaps, just perhaps, the old master would remember what it felt like to have purpose. Beyond mere survival, Marcus arrived at the dojo the next afternoon carrying a brown paper bag and wearing clothes that had clearly been selected with care. His cleanest jeans and a faded but spotless t-shirt. Hiroshi was already there, having spent the morning preparing a training routine he hadn't used in years. The master watched as the boy stood uncertainly in the doorway, taking in the sacred space with wide eyes. "Remove your shoes," Hiroshi instructed gently. "In the dojo, we show respect to the place where we learn." Marcus carefully untied his sneakers and placed them neatly by the entrance, copying the precise way Hiroshi had arranged his own worn sandals. The boy's socks had small holes near the toes, but they were clean. Hiroshi appreciated the effort. It showed character that couldn't be taught. "Before we begin training, you work," Hiroshi said, leading Marcus to a storage closet filled with equipment that hadn't been used in months. A true martial artist maintains his training space. This teaches discipline before the body learns technique. For the next hour, Marcus helped organize wooden blocks, polish mirrors, and arrange the heavy bags that hung from the ceiling like silent sentinels. The boy worked without complaint, asking careful questions about each piece of equipment. When he struggled to lift a particularly heavy practice board, Hiroshi stepped in to help, their hands briefly touching as they maneuvered it into place. "Master Tanaka," Marcus said as they finished the organizing, "why don't you have other students?" The directness of the question caught Hiroshi off guard. Children, he remembered, had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things that adults danced around. He considered his answer carefully, settling on a truth that wouldn't burden such young shoulders. "Sometimes life changes, and we must adapt. Now I have you, which is enough." They began with the most basic elements: proper stance, breathing, the concept of center. Hiroshi demonstrated the horse stance, his aged body still remembering the precise angles and balance points that had been drilled into him decades ago in Okinawa. Marcus mimicked him with the natural adaptability of youth, though his legs trembled after only 30 seconds. "Breathe," Hiroshi reminded him. "The breath is the foundation of all power. Without proper breathing, technique is just movement." As they practiced, Hiroshi found himself slipping into teaching rhythms he thought he'd forgotten. His voice took on the cadence of instruction, patient but firm, encouraging without accepting laziness. Marcus absorbed every word with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting his whole short life for this kind of attention and structure. The boy's brown paper bag, it turned out, contained a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, his after-school snack that he'd brought to share. During their break, sitting cross-legged on the polished floor, Marcus offered half of his sandwich to Hiroshi with the unconscious generosity of a child who understood hunger. "My mum made extra," he lied transparently, holding out the larger portion. Hiroshi accepted the sandwich with the same formal bow he might give to receive a black belt, understanding that this simple gesture carried more weight than the boy realized. They ate in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows and warming the wooden floors. "Master Tanaka," Marcus said between bites of apple, "do you have kids?" The question hit like a physical blow, but Hiroshi kept his expression neutral. "I had a son once. He would be a man now, older than your mother. Where is he?" "He is with the ancestors," Hiroshi said simply, using the phrase that had comforted him through countless sleepless nights. "But his spirit remains in the lessons I learned from being his father." Marcus nodded with the solemn acceptance that children sometimes show when confronted with concepts beyond their years. He seemed to sense that this was sacred ground, not to be explored further with casual questions. They spent the remaining hour working on basic punches, Hiroshi's hands guiding Marcus's small fists through the proper motion. The master's touch was gentle but precise, adjusting angles and explaining the flow of energy from foot to hip to shoulder to knuckle. Each correction was accompanied by explanation, building understanding alongside muscle memory. When Maria arrived to collect her son, she found them seated in meditation position. Marcus's eyes squeezed shut in concentration as he tried to match Hiroshi's serene stillness. The sight of her energetic boy sitting motionless struck her as almost miraculous. "How did he do?" she asked in the mix of English and Spanish that colored her speech when she was tired. "He has natural balance," Hiroshi replied formally. "And more importantly, he has respect for learning. Tomorrow we will continue." As they prepared to leave, Marcus surprised everyone, including himself, by running back to Hiroshi and wrapping his small arms around the master's waist in an impulsive hug. For a moment, Hiroshi froze, his body remembering the weight of his own son's embraces from decades past. Then his hands settled gently on the boy's shoulders, returning the gesture with the careful tenderness of someone handling something precious and fragile. "Thank you, Master," Marcus said, his voice muffled against Hiroshi's G. After they left, Hiroshi remained in the dojo as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. The silence felt different again, not empty, but expectant. Tomorrow there would be more lessons, more small victories, more moments of connection that had nothing to do with perfect technique and everything to do with the simple human need to matter to someone else. He walked to the shrine and lit fresh incense, whispering a prayer of gratitude to Akiko and Kenji. Perhaps they had sent him this child, this second chance to remember what it meant to guide and protect and teach. The old master smiled as he locked the dojo, already planning tomorrow's lesson. 3 weeks into their routine, Marcus had become as much a fixture of the dojo as the heavy bags and mirrors. He arrived each afternoon with the punctuality of someone who had found their place in the world. His school backpack traded for a small gym bag that Maria had bought him at a thrift store. Inside, he kept a change of clothes and a water bottle decorated with cartoon characters that he was beginning to outgrow but couldn't bear to replace. Hiroshi had watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. The boy's stance had improved dramatically, his kicks were gaining height and control, and more importantly, his confidence was blossoming. Marcus no longer hung back when speaking to adults or flinched when other children raised their voices in the playground. The discipline of karate was teaching him that he had power, not over others, but over himself. On this particular Thursday, they were working on a new kata, a flowing sequence of movements that told the story of defending against multiple attackers. Marcus had been struggling with a complex turn that required him to pivot on his left foot while executing a high block, but he was determined to master it before the lesson ended. "Remember," Hiroshi coached from beside the mirrors, "the movement begins in your center, not your arms. Feel the power rising from your stance." Marcus nodded seriously, his face scrunched in concentration as he repeated the sequence. Turn, block, strike, step forward. His technique was improving with each repetition, but his young mind was processing so many details at once that he occasionally lost track of his spatial awareness. It happened during what should have been a routine pivot. Marcus spun too quickly, misjudged his distance from the wooden practice dummy, and his extended arms struck the solid oak post with a sickening crack that echoed through the dojo like a gunshot. The boy's scream of pain cut through Hiroshi's chest like a blade. Marcus crumpled to the floor, clutching his left wrist against his body, his face white with shock and tears streaming down his cheeks. The master was beside him instantly, his hands gentle but firm as he assessed the injury. "Let me see," Hiroshi said softly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had dealt with training injuries before. "Breathe slowly, Marcus. In through your nose, out through your mouth." The wrist was already beginning to swell, and when Hiroshi gently palpated the area, he could feel the unmistakable displacement of broken bone. His heart sank, not just from concern for Marcus's pain, but from the immediate understanding of what this meant. Hospital bills, potential lawsuits, angry parents, all the nightmares that had destroyed his dojo before rushing back like a flood. "It hurts," Marcus sobbed, his child's bravery finally cracking under the reality of serious injury. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Hiroshi said firmly, carefully helping the boy to his feet while supporting the injured arm. "Accidents happen in training. This is not your fault, and it is not a failure. You were learning, and sometimes learning involves risk." He fashioned a makeshift sling from a clean towel and called Maria's workplace, explaining the situation with careful precision. Her response was immediate. She would meet them at San Francisco General Hospital. Hiroshi helped Marcus into his old Toyota, the boy's tears gradually subsiding as the master maintained a steady stream of reassuring conversation. The emergency room was a chaos of fluorescent lights and antiseptic, smells that brought back unwelcome memories of Akiko's final months. Hiroshi sat beside Marcus in the hard plastic chairs, the boy leaning against him unconsciously while they waited for Maria to arrive. Other parents might have questioned how the accident happened, demanded explanations, threatened legal action, But when Maria burst through the automatic doors, her face pale with worry, and her work uniform wrinkled from running, her first concern was purely maternal. "Mijo, are you okay?" she said, dropping to her knees beside Marcus's chair and carefully examining his makeshift sling. "Does it hurt very much?" "Master Tanaka took good care of me," Marcus said, his loyalty touching in its simplicity. "He says accidents happen when you're learning." Maria looked up at Hiroshi, and he saw in her eyes the questions she wasn't asking, about liability, about blame, about whether she could trust this man with her most precious responsibility. But she also saw something else. Marcus was calmer than he should be for a child with a broken bone, and he was looking at Hiroshi with an expression of complete trust. The X-rays confirmed a clean break in the radius, requiring a cast but nothing more serious. As they waited for the orthopedic technician, Marcus surprised everyone by asking when he could return to training. "The doctor says 6 weeks," Maria said, reading from the discharge papers. "But maybe we should wait longer, make sure you're completely healed." "But Mom," Marcus protested, "Master Tanaka needs my help with the dojo, and I was just starting to get the kata right." Hiroshi felt something twist in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer and more complex. This child, injured in his care, was worried about abandoning him. The loyalty was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. "The dojo will wait for you," Hiroshi said quietly. "Healing properly is more important than any technique. A true martial artist respects his body's need to recover." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Marcus tugged on Hiroshi's sleeve with his good hand. "Master Tanaka, you're not going to close the dojo because I got hurt, are you?" The question revealed a wisdom beyond the boy's years, an understanding that adults sometimes made decisions based on fear rather than logic. Hiroshi knelt to Marcus's eye level, placing his hands formally on his knees in a gesture of respect. "A master does not abandon his student because of one setback," he said solemnly. "When your arm heals, we will continue your training. Until then, you can help in other ways. Organizing equipment, learning theory, practicing meditation." The smile that spread across Marcus's face made the entire terrifying afternoon worthwhile. As they walked to the parking garage, the boy chattering excitedly about how cool his cast would look and whether he could get it signed, Hiroshi realized something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about teaching karate or keeping his dojo alive. Somewhere in the space between that first afternoon and this moment, Marcus had become something more precious and more frightening than a student. He had become someone worth protecting. The 6 weeks of Marcus's recovery transformed the dojo in unexpected ways. Unable to practice physical techniques, the boy threw himself into learning the philosophical aspects of martial arts with an intensity that both impressed and concerned Hiroshi. Every afternoon, Marcus would arrive with his cast-covered arm in a sling, ready to absorb lessons about honor, respect, and the responsibility that came with knowledge of combat. They spent hours sitting on the polished floor, Hiroshi sharing stories from his own training in Okinawa, tales of masters who could break boards with their minds as much as their hands, of discipline so complete that physical limitations became merely obstacles to overcome, rather than excuses for surrender. Marcus listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed a maturity far beyond his 8 years. "Master Tanaka," he said one afternoon as they organized equipment with careful one-handed precision, "why did you really keep teaching me after the other students left?" Hiroshi paused in his arrangement of wooden practice swords, considering how to answer truthfully without burdening the child with adult complexities. When a master finds a student with true spirit, he has a responsibility to nurture that gift. "Your dedication reminds me why I became a teacher." The truth was more complicated and more painful. Marcus's presence had become the difference between existing and living, between maintaining empty routines and having genuine purpose. The boy's enthusiasm had rekindled something in Hiroshi that he thought had died with his family. The deep satisfaction of watching someone grow under his guidance, of mattering to another human being in a fundamental way. Maria had noticed the change in both of them. Her son came home each day with stories about samurai philosophy and proper breathing techniques, his vocabulary peppered with Japanese terms he pronounced with careful precision. But more importantly, Marcus had developed a quiet confidence that extended far beyond the dojo walls. His grades improved. He stood up to playground bullies without resorting to violence, and he carried himself with the dignity of someone who knew his own worth. The accident had also revealed something about Maria's character that impressed Hiroshi deeply. Despite the hospital bills and the lost wages from leaving work early, she never once suggested that Marcus should stop training. Instead, she quietly took on extra cleaning jobs to cover the expenses, arriving to pick up her son each evening with tired eyes but unwavering support for his passion. One particularly busy Thursday afternoon, as they practiced meditation techniques that didn't require the use of both hands, Marcus suddenly broke from his seated position and looked directly at Hiroshi with an expression of pure determination. "I want to test for my yellow belt as soon as my cast comes off," he announced. "I've been practicing all the kata in my head, and I know I can do it." Hiroshi smiled at the boy's confidence, remembering his own eagerness to advance through the ranking system decades ago. "Testing requires more than mental preparation, Marcus. Your body must remember the movements, and that will take time after 6 weeks of inactivity." "But I've been watching you demonstrate every day," Marcus insisted. "And I've been doing the stances and breathing exercises. I'm ready. I know I am." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door chiming. Both master and student looked up to see 3 young men enter the dojo, their movements carrying the casual aggression of people accustomed to taking what they wanted. The leader, a teenager with bleached hair and expensive sneakers, surveyed the space with obvious disdain. "This is the famous karate school?" he said mockingly to his companions. "Looks like a retirement home for has-beens." Hiroshi rose smoothly to his feet, positioning himself slightly in front of Marcus in a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. The protective instinct that had lain dormant for years awakened with startling intensity. "How may I help you?" he asked formally, his voice carrying decades of training in courtesy that masked readiness for violence. "We heard there's some old Japanese guy teaching fake martial arts to little kids," the leader continued, stepping closer with deliberate intimidation. "We're here to test how real your kung fu is, old man." Marcus jumped to his feet beside Hiroshi, his caste forgotten in the rush of indignation. "Don't talk to my dad like that!" The words hung in the air like the echo of a struck bell. Everyone in the room froze. The 3 troublemakers surprised by the fierce loyalty of such a small defender, Marcus suddenly realizing what he had said, and Hiroshi feeling his world shift on its axis in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Your dad?" the leader said with cruel amusement. "That's not your dad, kid. That's just some lonely old man playing pretend with someone else's brat." The effect on Marcus was immediate and devastating. His face flushed red with embarrassment and confusion, his good hand trembling as he looked between Hiroshi and the sneering teenagers. The master saw the exact moment when the boy's confidence cracked, when the casual cruelty of strangers made him question the bond he had felt so certain of moments before. But Hiroshi also felt something else rising in his chest, a protective fury that had nothing to do with martial arts philosophy and everything to do with the primal need to defend his own. Because in that moment, listening to Marcus call him dad with such natural affection, he realized that the boy had become exactly that in every way that mattered. "You will leave now," Hiroshi said, his voice dropping to a tone his students from decades past would have recognized as genuinely dangerous. "This is a place of learning and respect. You have neither." The teenagers sensed the change in atmosphere, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with potential violence. The leader took a step back, suddenly uncertain, his bravado wavering in the face of someone who had forgotten more about fighting than they would ever learn. "Whatever, old man," he muttered, gesturing for his friends to follow him toward the door. "Come on, this place is pathetic anyway." As the door closed behind them, Marcus remained frozen in place, his face a mixture of mortification and hope. Hiroshi knelt beside him, placing gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. "Marcus," he said softly, "you called me Dad." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I know you're not really my dad. I would be honored," Hiroshi interrupted, his own voice thick with emotion, "if you meant it." The embrace that followed was fierce and desperate. 2 people who had found family in the most unexpected place clinging to each other against a world that often seemed designed to tear such bonds apart. And in that moment, surrounded by the tools of an ancient art in a dojo that had witnessed both loss and renewal, a master and his student discovered that some relationships transcend blood, built instead on respect, dedication, and the simple human need to belong to someone who understands your worth. 6 months after Marcus first walked through the dojo doors, the yellow belt test had become a community event. Word had spread through Japantown about the old master who had found new purpose and the determined boy who had brought life back to the abandoned academy. Nearly 30 people filled the small space: neighbors, shopkeepers, Maria's co-workers, and even some former students who had heard about Hiroshi's return to teaching. Marcus stood in the center of the polished floor, his left arm fully healed and strong again, wearing a crisp white gi that Maria had saved for months to afford. The boy's posture radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place through dedication rather than natural talent. Beside him, 3 other new students waited their turn, children whose parents had been drawn to the dojo by stories of respectful discipline and genuine care. The accident had been a turning point in ways none of them could have predicted. Rather than driving students away, the story of how Master Tanaka had handled the crisis with grace and responsibility had drawn families to the academy. Parents appreciated a teacher who understood that growth sometimes came with risks, but who also took those risks seriously and responded with wisdom rather than panic. Testing begins with meditation, Hiroshi announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone conducting sacred business. A martial artist must demonstrate control of mind before control of body. Marcus settled into Caesar position with practiced ease, his breathing deep and steady as he centered himself for the challenges ahead. The months of forced meditation during his recovery had taught him patience in a way that physical training alone never could. Now, as he prepared to demonstrate everything he had learned, that patience served as his foundation. The test proceeded through increasingly complex requirements. Basic stances flowed into simple kata, combinations built towards sparring exercises, and throughout it all, Marcus moved with the fluid precision of someone who had internalized the principles rather than simply memorizing techniques. When he executed the complex pivot that had caused his injury months before, the watching crowd held its collective breath, but this time, his control was perfect. Maria stood against the back wall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she watched her son perform movements that would have seemed impossible when he was just another restless child looking for somewhere to belong. The transformation went far beyond physical skills. Marcus carried himself now with quiet dignity, spoke to adults with respectful directness, and approached challenges with the methodical patience of someone who understood that mastery came through consistent effort rather than dramatic gestures. Final requirement, Hiroshi called out as Marcus finished his kata with a sharp ki that echoed through the dojo. Self-defense demonstration. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marcus faced one of the older students, a 12-year-old named David, whose family had joined the dojo after witnessing Marcus's dedication. The scenario was simple: escape from a grab, using minimal force and maximum control. As David reached for his shoulder, Marcus flowed into the defensive sequence they had practiced hundreds of times, redirecting his opponent's energy and creating distance without causing harm. "Stop," Hiroshi commanded, and both boys immediately froze in position. "What is the most important principle you just demonstrated?" "Avoiding unnecessary conflict," Marcus answered without hesitation. "The goal is to be safe, not to win." The master nodded approvingly, then addressed the entire gathering. "This is what we teach here. Not aggression, but confidence. Not violence, but control. Not winning, but understanding." The formal presentation of the yellow belt was conducted with full ceremony. Marcus knelt in Caesar as Hiroshi tied the new rank around his waist, the bright yellow standing out against the white GI like a small sun. The watching crowd applauded, but the real moment came afterward, when the formal distance of master and student briefly dissolved into something more personal. "I'm proud of you, son," Hiroshi said quietly, the word carrying weight that went far beyond martial arts achievement. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the other students said their goodbyes, the 3 people who had become an unlikely family remained in the quiet dojo. Maria helped Marcus carefully fold his new belt, while Hiroshi began the evening cleaning routine that had once been a lonely ritual, but now felt like a shared responsibility. "Master Tanaka," Marcus said, using the formal address, even in this moment of celebration, "when can I start preparing for Orange Belt?" The master laughed, the sound rich with genuine joy. "Tomorrow we begin basics again. Every belt requires new understanding of what you thought you already knew. As they prepared to leave, Maria pulled Hiroshi aside while Marcus gathered his equipment. "I want to thank you," she said in the mixture of English and Spanish that came naturally when her emotions ran deep. "Not just for the karate, but for everything. He's become a different child, confident, respectful, focused. You've given him something I couldn't." "He gave me something too," Hiroshi replied, watching Marcus practice his new kata in the mirror with unconscious pride. Purpose, family, hope for the future. The dojo that had been empty and echoing with ghosts 6 months ago now hummed with quiet activity. 5 regular students with 3 more starting next week. Equipment that was used daily rather than gathering dust. Most importantly, laughter and conversation where there had been only silence. As they walked to their cars under the San Francisco streetlights, Marcus between his 2 parental figures, the boy looked up at Hiroshi with the directness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Dad," he said, using the word that had once been an accident but now felt as natural as breathing. "Do you think Grandma Akiko and Uncle Kenji would be proud of how I did today?" Hiroshi stopped walking, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance in the question, by the way Marcus had absorbed not just techniques, but philosophy, not just lessons, but love. The boy understood that honoring the past was part of building the future, that family was bigger than blood, and that some bonds were forged in dojos and tested in daily dedication. "They would be very proud," Hiroshi said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "And they would be grateful, as I am, that you came into our lives." The 3 of them continued toward home, their shadows stretching long behind them on the pavement, the yellow belt visible even in the dim light, a symbol of achievement, but more importantly, of belonging. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to grow together. But tonight, they were simply a family walking home, complete in ways that had nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with the human capacity to find connection in the most unexpected places. The way of the empty dojo had become the way of the full heart, and Master Hiroshi Tanaka had learned that sometimes the most profound lessons came not from teaching, but from being willing to be taught by an 8-year-old boy who saw potential where others saw only a lonely old man with fading dreams. In the distance, the lights of the dojo glowed softly through the windows, waiting for tomorrow's students, tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's small miracles of human connection forged through discipline, respect, and the simple courage to call a stranger dad.